Good evening and welcome to tonight's iteration of Medicine for the Public. I'm going to go ahead and get us started, although I must confess that I'm sure that there will be many more people coming in, probably for a variety of reasons. I spent about 15 minutes on the Rockville Pike trying to turn right to get in, and I didn't have to run the gauntlet that most of you did to get through the security to have your trunk searched. So I apologize for all the trouble that you have getting onto campus. These are days that none of us would have predicted, I think, with what's going on in our community currently and what's going on in our world. And so I'm pleased that so many of you have come out to hear what I think will be a very interesting and hopefully entertaining discussion about the teen brain. I have a 12-year-old daughter, and I tried to get her to come with me tonight. And she said, "What's the talk about?" And I said, "It's about the teen brain." And she said, and I quote, "Duh, that'll be a short talk." So with that introduction, let me tell you a little bit about what you're going to hear about tonight. This is our 26th year of these presentations, and as most of you know by now who've come to previous ones, we take them very seriously and really value your input. Before we introduce tonight's speaker, let me just take a couple of seconds to talk about how the presentation will work. Dr. Geed will present his lecture, and then some of you will want to leave immediately. Please do so as quickly and quietly as possible at the end of the lecture. There are some people who come with a question or two to ask at the end and have come just for that question. So if you're leaving, please remember to be very quiet until you get outside the auditorium because those questions are important to a lot of the folks. If you do have a question, please come to the microphones in either aisle and speak directly into the microphones, and it may take a second to have them pick you up, but we want to record those questions as well. Also, please do not forget to fill out the evaluation forms that are in your packet. Those evaluation forms help us decide what kind of presentations you all want to hear. And as I said, this series is very important to us on this campus. As a final reminder, and let me underscore this one, please remember to refrain from talking during the presentation. And also, in this day and age, I have to ask you to turn off your cell phones, or at least put them on the vibrate mode, and if you get a call, please leave the auditorium. Now let me take a couple of minutes to tell you about tonight's speaker. Dr. Jay Geed is a practicing child and adolescent psychiatrist and chief of brain imaging in the child psychiatry branch at the National Institute of Mental Health. His primary research interests have focused on the biological basis of cognitive, emotional, and behavioral disorders in children and adolescents. His magnetic resonance imaging studies have really shed new light on brain development in healthy and neuropsychiatrically impaired youth. Dr. Geed received his undergraduate and medical degrees from the University of North Dakota, completed his training with 3 years of residency in psychiatry at the Menninger School of Psychiatry in Topeka, Kansas, and 2 years of residency in child and adolescent psychiatry at Duke University in Durham. He joined the child psychiatry branch in 1991 as a senior staff fellow. He's board certified in general, child, adolescent, and geriatric psychiatry, pretty much covering the landscape. He's received numerous honors, including the National Institute of Health Fellows Award for Research Excellence, the A.E. Bennett Award Commendation, and the Max Hamilton Memorial Prize for outstanding contributions to psychopharmacology from the Collegium Internationale Neuropsychopharmacologicum. So you can try running that one off if you want. As I said, tonight he's going to speak on the teen brain, and I, for one, will be a very careful audience. Dr. Jay Geed.
Well, thank you all very much for coming tonight. When I told people about the topic of my talk, I got many comments similar to what Dr. Henderson's daughter remarked. These are some of the initial comments I gathered. Right on with Dr. Henderson's daughter. Oh, you mean they found one? Isn't that a contradiction of terms? and what is my next talk on the Loch Ness Monster. But what I do hope to demonstrate tonight is that although sometimes teams may engage in some risky behavior or appear moody or trying a few different identities, that mostly this is a time of wonderful energy, of high ideals, of passion, and of growth. I think probably when most of you came to this talk tonight about teen brain, you were probably really interested in teen behavior. Brain, behavior, behavior, brain, they tend to go hand in hand. And this notion of the link between brain and behavior really dates back to antiquity. This demonstrates the practice of trephining, or the boring of holes in the skull. One thought is that that would allow a passageway for evil spirits to escape the brain. And as crude as this form of surgery may seem, it wasn't always fatal, as we can see from this particular skull, which has a rim of calcification around it, indicating 2 to 5 years of healing. So this person at least lived long enough to be trephined a second time. And I found it interesting that this practice developed in many parts of the world independently, much like the bow and arrow, which I always thought was not an obvious weapon to develop. And it's still practiced in some parts of the world, and it may enjoy a resurgence in this country because the brevity of the procedure is very attractive to managed care companies. Even the ancient Greek philosophers, though, noted this relationship between the brain and behavior. Hippocrates, from nothing else but the brain come joys, delights, laughter, and sports, and sorrows, griefs, despondency, and lamentations. And by the same organ we acquire wisdom and knowledge, and see and hear and know what are foul and what are fair, what are sweet and what are unsavory. But all of this knowledge took a gigantic leap backwards with Aristotle. And Aristotle's thinking held great sway for several centuries. But he believed that the heart and not the brain was the center for our thoughts and emotions. And he based this on the observation that our heart speeds up or slows down in different emotional states. The brain, he thought, served only like a radiator to cool the blood, much like we now think that elephant's ears or rabbit's ears serve as. And I'm afraid I think that's what my brain was doing when I made the slide, because Aristotle didn't speak English, so this is not really a quotation. And even though we're pretty well connected here at the NIH, we're not this well connected. And it turns out this is a bust of Voltaire and not Aristotle. But the general notion still held that his thinking led us astray. But eventually, overwhelming evidence from the battlefield clearly established that it was indeed the brain responsible for our thoughts and emotions. But the subtleties of that relationship have really remained at the heart of philosophical and psychological debate since that time. René Descartes, with his famous cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, or his less famous last words of, I don't think so. A lot of what we learned about the details of the relationship between brain and behavior was a result of tragic accidents. And the most celebrated accident in all of neuroscience is the case of Phineas Gage. And Phineas was a hard-working, responsible, well-liked railway foreman in the Burlington Railroad back in 1848. And he was taking a tamping iron, which is about 1 inch thick, 3.5 feet long, and tamping down some blasting powder for a dynamite charge. The usual practice when doing this was to put a piece of cloth down to avoid sparks, but Phineas Gage forgot to do that, and there was a spark and an explosion. And it sent this rod into his left cheek, through his brain, and out the top of his skull. This is the actual brain reconstructed from his skull. Phineas Gage fell back. He was sort of in a stupor, but he never lost consciousness. They put him on an ox cart and took him about 2 miles just to the local country doctor there, Dr. Harlow. And Dr. Harlow wrote his account of this description and of actually the rest of Phineas Gage's life. As Dr. Harlow put his left hand fingers into the entry wound in the cheek, and his right hand into the hole in the top of the brain. His fingers touched. And all the while he was doing this, Phineas Gage was asking, when am I going to be able to get back to work? And actually, he bounced back, quite well physically. But psychologically, he was never the same. This hard-working, responsible person became very ill-mannered, foul-mouthed, took to drink, had all these extravagant schemes that never quite worked out, traveled with P.T. Barnum's circus with his tapping rod as a sideshow. His friends had the most piercing statement regarding this, and that was that Gage was no longer Gage. And it led us to understand that this part of the brain in the front here might be responsible for many of the things that, in a sense, separate man from beast. Well, in another half of last century, another group joined the philosophers and the psychologists and the psychiatrists on this question, and that group was the physicists, with the creation of tools to look at the brain, such as X-rays, computerized tomography, CT scans, positron emission tomography, PET scans. And the modality of choice for work with children, MRI, or magnetic resonance imaging. MRI is good because it doesn't use any radiation. So that allows you not only to scan children, but to scan them repeatedly over time. And when this tool became available, we wanted to pursue the hypothesis that many of the most severe illnesses in child psychiatry represent deviations of normal brain development. And to use this tool to scan a large number of healthy and neuropsychiatrically ill children to see how their brains might be growing differently. We do these scans on Tuesday nights, on tonight, for the last 12 years. In fact, as we speak, there are children and teens getting scanned, one floor beneath us. And what this is a movie clip that shows the scanning procedure.
He too is grappling with the teenage world, trying to untangle the workings and wirings of the adolescent brain. This doctor is crossing.
In case my boss is watching, I usually get in a little bit earlier.
Understanding of adolescence.
I think people for generations have been fascinated by teen behavior and what's happening in teens. But for so long to actually look inside the biology of teen behavior is very elusive. And we just haven't had the technology, the tools to try to create the so-called black box.
But now he does. Dr. Gee of the National Institute of Mental Health gets the use of this imaging machine one night a week to look at the brain structure of normal children. Teens come in and sometimes even sleep in this large magnet, so we can take a long, hard look inside their brains.
Now, for the first time in our human history, we can actually start exploring the living and growing activity of the human brain. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, blast off.
What he discovered in the all-important part of the brain that sits behind the forehead, in an area called the frontal cortex, was an unexpected growth spurt and overproduction of cells just before puberty.
And this is a process that when you happen in the womb, maybe even the first 18 months of life. But it was only when we started following the same children by scanning their brains at 2 intervals that we detected a second wave of overproduction. And this second wave of overproduction is manifested by an actual thickening in the brain matter, the thinking part, in the front parts of the brain.
Many people mistakenly believe that most of the changes occur in the first few years of life, and that after a child is about 3, it was actually relatively little change occurring, and we know that is absolutely incorrect.
Well, I think the most surprising thing has been how much the teen brain has changed. By age 6, the brain is already 95% of its adult size. But the gray matter, the thinking part of the brain, continues to thicken throughout childhood as the brain cells develop extra connections, much like a tree growing extra branches, twigs, and roots.
After these brain scans are acquired, the next task is to analyze them. And in the early going, this was done much like medieval monks transcribing records of having people sit in dark rooms with a computer mouse and patiently use the mouse to outline brain structure after brain structure. We actually have on our team, who I think is the world's best rater at this, Kathy Vaitusas, who has probably outlined more brain structures than anybody in the world and has been able to do so reliably in structures that no one else has. But even she wasn't able to keep up with all the new scans coming in, now numbering over 2,000. And as this progressed, it was clear that we needed to rely on computers more and more to help us. And we benefited enormously from the advances in computer technology during the 90s. In the early stages, there were two main competing techniques. The first technique was animal. And as you see, I think engineers tend to have a penchant for acronyms, but this animal stands for automatic, nonlinear image matching and anatomical labeling. And what happens in this technique is that one brain was scanned like 27 times to get a very accurate picture of the brain. And then a team of neuroanatomists broke the brain down into its smallest parts. And the smallest parts in these pictures are voxels. Tiny, tiny bits of brain. And every voxel in the MR image was assigned to being gray matter, white matter, fluid, and belonging to a structure or group of structures. It became the gold standard template brain. The second step of this is to take the brain from the teen and morph it onto this gold standard template brain, using very similar technology to the morphing you see in movies like in The Terminator. The same sort of math, the same sort of people involved, actually, of applying these technologies. And so the teen's brain is morphed onto this gold standard brain, and then in a sense it picks up its label. It says, if I'm on this part of the brain, I should be gray matter in the frontal lobe. Then the process is mathematically reversed, and the brain goes back to its original size and shape, but it hangs on to its label. So based on its location in space, that voxel knows whether it's supposed to be gray, white, and what part of the brain it's supposed to belong to. Not a bad technique. It did have limitations.